Hi guys, how's it going? So in this video I wanted to take you guys through this package which is Flutter background service. When I came across this package before and when I had to implement a background task for my use case, as a Flutter developer, I found it slightly difficult and cumbersome to firstly understand this package and use it properly because when I came across this example here, I saw that this example is really convoluted in the sense that they have added a lot of things that are not even directly related to the package, such as this shared preferences thing here and even a local notification format and a little bit more. It was slightly tricky to understand in the beginning. And also, since I did not have much of an experience with Android native side, right? To understand and harness this package to the best of its ability was slightly tricky. So in this video, the point that I'll try to do is that I will take you through the Flutter implementation of this package first. Then I will also try to give you an overview on how the Flutter side talks with the Android native side. A side note here, I will be using certain technicalities from the Android native side as well, and I will make sure to link all of the sources from where I learned them in the description, so that you guys can just watch this video and then go into the description and then get a grip of how the native side is working a bit, so that you can harness this package to the best of its ability. Okay, so let's begin. So firstly, a quick intro on where this package is used. So this package is generally used in examples where you would want to continue some kind of a functionality even when the user is not accessing the app or has even taken the app out of the task manager itself. So a simple example for this can be when you are making a music playing app, and even if the user quits your application and takes it out of the task manager, the music should not stop playing. So in those kind of use cases, you can use this package, right? So in Android, it implements something known as Android services, and that's how it operates and implements this functionality in the backend. So let's begin with the Flutter side, and then we will go on to see how in this diagram, how side by side the Android functionality also gets invoked. So when you start with this package, the first step that you do is that you configure it. So you configure the package, and when you configure the package, you basically initialize all the parameters. So there will be certain set of parameters such as do you want it to be a foreground service, do you want it to be a background service, do you want to attach a custom notification channel to it, and whatnot. So this, you can think of this as a initialization step, right? Then you will go ahead and you will start the service. So when you start the service here, on the Android side, this is the time where it actually invokes the service and creates another foreground or background service, which ends up implementing that whole scenario in which even if you take out the app from the task manager, that service will still be alive. Okay, so and then after starting the service out, you basically have certain listeners here on the Flutter side, which you can use to configure this service, right? So basically, I will spawn listeners such as set as foreground, set as background, and stop service. So what this would be doing is that once the service starts, right, these listeners will come into play, and now I can, through these listeners, talk to the service and implement these scenarios. So these scenarios are as simple as it sounds. Basically, set as foreground will change the background service to a foreground service. Set as background will change the background to the foreground to the background, sorry. And stop service will basically call self stop on itself and stop that service that is running. So this is as simple as it is on the Flutter side. Now on the Android side, what happens is that they are using something known as method channels to talk back and forth between the Flutter and Android side. Okay, so when you configure the package using the method channels, what Android does is that it uses shared preferences to set these configuration details. Right? So this is what happens on the native side of things. And when you start the service, sorry, I'll use this color. When you start the service, it uses the same channels to invoke a method which can now go ahead and start either a foreground service or a background service based on whatever parameter you suggested in the shared preferences in this step, right? So now it will start this service and it will also bind this service to the main plugin. Okay, so the services will be bound in nature, but they will not be strictly bounded services. They will be foreground and background services, but also bounded to the main UI, right? And then for the listener side, you would see a similar implementation using, I feel it's a broadcast receiver. So there would be receivers. I'm sorry, I'll use this color. Uh, there would be a broadcast receiver and some listeners set here, which would basically be doing this back and forth communication and notifying each other that about the functionality, such as whether you want to stop the service or you want to change the service type and whatnot. Another small side note is that they have also implemented a watchdog receiver here, which basically its job is that every 5 seconds it just checks whether this service is still alive or not. I feel they have done this because there might be a chance that the OS might just take out your service in some cases when it's running in the background and the main UI is not active. And if that happens at any point of time, the watchdog receiver using the alarm task manager will restart the service, and it would look to the user that the service is constantly running no matter what. So this is what primarily is the whole flow of this package. All right, so let's jump into the code from now. So I've set up this new project to implement this background service. And to start off with, of course, we need to add this dependency here in our pubspec.yaml file. You can copy paste this directly from that documentation page. Once you have done this, run pub.get to make sure that the package is there. I've already run it, so I'll not do that again. And now you'll be able to see that I have a very simplistic setup. So there's a main file, and I have shifted the UI element into a different page because we don't necessarily need to look into the UI and break our heads on this, right? When there will be certain elements that we need to discuss about, I'll just pick them up and discuss them separately. But for now, let's just completely focus on how to set up the background service and the topics that are related to that. So let's start from here. So as I mentioned in my graph before, the first step would be the configuration. So for that, firstly, we'll have to create a main service. So I'll make this async since we'll be dealing with futures, and I'll just make sure that all the Flutter bindings have been initialized. It's just best practice. And now we'll go on with the configuration. So I'll create a function which would be initialize service. And after I have done this initialization of the service, this will basically take care of everything and basically spawn the service. And after that, I will use run app to render the UI that I had created using that stateful widget over here. So you can see that the name of this app is my app, and basically what this will do is that it'll initialize our service and then it'll just start that my app widget so that we can talk back and forth with the background service. So now let's implement this initialize service. So to implement this initialize service, it will return a future service and it will be sync type, right? So now in this part, we will first be configuring the service as I had mentioned in the graph before, and then we will start the service, right? So to do all of that, firstly we will create an instance of the Flutter background service here. So let's store it in this variable known as service, and now we will call service.configure, right? So now as you can see, by the way, this configure function returns a future, and that is why I added the await tag, and it returns a bool here. So okay, so now since I will be focusing on the Android side of things, I'll just make a dummy initialization for the iOS configuration and leave it as it is, and I'll dive into the Android side of things. So let's implement that. Okay, so over here you can see that there are two required parameters. One is on start and one is foreground mode. So is foreground mode basically is a parameter that is asking on whether do you want this service to be a foreground service when you started, or do you want it to be a background service. So I'll just say true here because I want it to be a foreground service, right? And I'll come back to this Android configuration in a while. Let's just start the service and complete this function. So I'll just in the end say service dot, I'm sorry, I was not at the right place. Yeah. Just say service dot start. And this also creates a future, so I can await this as well. Alright, so this function in a nutshell has configured the service and has started it, right? So now let's just dive into what the configurations are. So let me start with these. So these are pretty self-explanatory. These two parameters will basically allow you to either start the service right on configuring itself, or you can also initialize this to make sure that every time the phone boots, that is restarts, the service will be initialized again. So these are pretty helpful configurations. Is foreground mode we already talked about, and now these configurations are related to what kind of notification do you want the app to show. So when you have a foreground service, there will be a notification that would be displayed on the app, right? So these parameters will determine what the content is and also which channel ID are you trying to focus on. If you make a custom one, you can insert your own channel IDs here and then customize it to your own use case. But we won't be using this, so we'll just keep it to the default value. Now let's come to the best part. This is the onStart. Now onStart, as you can see, is a reference to a function which takes service instance as its parameter, right? So now this is tightly coupled to how this package has been implemented. So in short, what it's expecting you to do is that it's expecting you to give a function reference which takes that service instance as a parameter, and in that function you can implement the meat of your logic. So everything that you want the service to do as soon as it has been started, that would be defined inside that onStart function. Now how is it invoked? We'll get to that a little later when I'll be going into the native side, but let's just implement this onStart function here. So to implement this onStart function, I'll just go into the documentation and I'll just copy paste the way they have implemented it. Right, so it looks something like this. So it's a simple void onStart async type of a function which takes the service instance as its parameter, and they have marked it as a VM entry point. Right, so now we can go ahead and implement this onStart. So in our use case, as I had mentioned in the graph before, we will be setting up the listeners over here. We will be setting up listeners so that we can talk with the listener and change this background service to a foreground service, a foreground service to a background service, or even stop the service overall. And as an additional functionality, what I would also do is that I'll add a timer within this logic, and its use case would be to update the notification that is being displayed by the foreground service. So if we have a foreground service in our example, there will be a notification corresponding to that, and that timer will constantly update the content of that notification. So we will be sure that our service is running even when we take it out of the task manager and whatnot, right? So let's implement that part. So I'll go into the documentation again and I'll copy paste this part. So yeah, this code is pretty self-explanatory. It's firstly determining whether it's an Android service instance, and if so, it is setting up these two listeners. So the on command returns a stream here, and it's basically listening for this method, and if it gets that, it basically invokes set as foreground service on the service instance. So if at any point of time it comes across these two methods, it will perform these tasks. One simple question that you guys can have is, where is this string coming from and where is this value coming from? So now this is inherently how the package has been implemented. So as we'll see in the native side of things as well, these are the same strings that have been used on the native side as well. So that is how they're communicating with each other. So it will be clearer when I go into that side of the code later on. But for now, let's move on and let's implement the service on stop as well. So I'll copy paste that code from their documentation. This is also fairly easy to understand. Basically, if at any point of time we receive this kind of a method channel invoke, it will implement service.stop self, right? So these are the listeners that have been put into this function. And now let's implement the timer functionality that I was talking about. So for that, I can just use timer.periodic. I can set a duration of, let's say, 2 seconds, and I can make this a const, and now I can implement the timer here, right? So to implement the timer, I'll go back into their code and I'll just copy paste the part that updates the notification channel. So this is the side. I'll indent it properly. Okay, so here you can see that they are again confirming whether it's an Android service. They're also making a check to confirm that a foreground service is running in the background, because only in that case there will be a notification. And if that is so, it goes ahead and updates this. So let's just change this to some custom name so that we know that it's working. And so I change the title and updated at the date time dot now will constantly keep changing because it will be the current tape. Now you can see there's an error being thrown on await here, so I feel if I can make this async, it should fix it. Yeah, good. So this part is done, and this is more or less it. So if we can implement this part of the onStart function, it will take care of all the things that I talked about. That is setting up the listeners and also updating the notification channel periodically. All right. All right. So since we have set up the service properly and we have made sure that it started, let's go into the UI to check how can we talk to the service, right? So the UI is pretty simple here. You can see that it only has 3 buttons in a column, and all of the on-pressed functions here are invoking the Flutter background service on the same string that we set the listeners on. So this is it. Basically, if you just do this, it will set the background to foreground, foreground to background, or in this case, it will either stop the service or it will start the service. So pretty self-explanatory, and the Flutter side of things looks very easy. So let's just run the app and make sure that everything is running fine. I just installed this application in my VM here, and you can see there are 3 buttons here as we had discussed before, right? So once I start the service, I had actually stopped the service before while testing it out. So if I start the service, now you can see that there's a background service which is running. And if I go into the logs, you'll be able to see there is a service which has been attached, and this background service logs are coming here, right? Now, if I go ahead and make it foreground, you'll see that a notification comes up here. And when I go into the notification, you'll see that the notification content is as we had configured before, and the time is also being updated every 2 seconds, right? So I can switch back and forth between the foreground and background. You can see that now the notification is not there. Now the notification come up, and if I want to stop the service, I can just stop the service from here, right? And it got stopped. Let's say start the service back again. And just to confirm that it's working well, I'll remove the app from the task manager, and you'll still see that this notification is still here, right? And you can see that it is getting updated even now, even though the app is not there in the task manager. So this is basically how this package works. And from now what we'll do is that we'll go through the code that we have written before, and we'll go step by step as to how it is being initialized from the Java native side as well. And I'll kind of take you through a walkthrough so that you'll be able to understand how the message passing is happening between the Flutter and the native side. And if you have a use case where you want to extend that functionality a little bit more, you can take it from there. Okay, so to start off with how to understand how the Android side of the code has been implemented, right? One starting point for you can be that you can just go into this Android folder here, and over here, if you go into app, source, main, Java, and then within this IO Flutter plugins, you'll see this registrant, and I had already opened this file here, so you can see that this is kind of the entry point for the plugin, background service plugin, and it injects itself over here, right? And if you want to find further implemented files, you'll have to go into external libraries here,
You'll have to go into Flutter plugins, and then over here you'll be able to see the implementations for Android, iOS, and the main plugin. So if I go into Android, I'll be able to see further files, which would help me understanding what the package does. Right. So now this can be one way of analyzing the packages, but I would suggest that you just go ahead and open this Android folder from File and Open. So if you just click on Android here and open this folder, you will get a far better and a more simplified view. So this is what it will look like. You'll have the main app and you'll have the Flutter background service. So each plugin that you add, the plugin's code will be available here directly. So you can just go in here and you'll see the same files that we saw there, but this is just far easier to access. So sure. So now if you go into that main plugin registrant file that I showed you, here you can see that it is trying to use this class to inject itself, right? So it's using Flutter background service plugin. And over here as well, we can see that there is a service plugin here, right? The same class. So let's start from here. Cool. So this is the class that kind of starts it all. And you can see that it's implementing Flutter plugin, method call handler, and service aware. So since it has a method call handler, it'll be listening to certain methods. And let's just dive back into the Flutter code and see where is it being invoked from exactly. So let's go into the main file that we just implemented, right? So here we are initializing the service and now we configure the service. So this should be the first entry point there, right? So if we go into configure here, you'll be able to see that the configure call is basically making a call on this platform instance. And if you go in here, this will be an interface implementation of it. Yeah. So over here, what happens in the background is that it uses this Android Flutter background service Android class, and it injects itself into that platform instance. So over here, you can see that there is a Flutter background service Android class, and over here, and using this register with, it kind of sets it as that platform instance back there into the interface. And so if we want to look at any method, we'll look at that method's implementation in this class. All right. So now that we were looking at configure, we'll go into this class and we'll see that there will be a configure enabled somewhere. Okay, so here it is. So over here we can analyze this code and try to understand how is it basically talking to that class that we just saw in the native side. So here you can see that it is setting a method channel firstly, and that method channel will have this ID here. So it is ID Flutter background service Android, right? So using this ID, it is setting the channel. Now it is also taking a callback handle for the onStart method that we had provided. Just a quick refresher, the onStart method was this method that we wanted to be invoked as soon as the service is started. So what it's doing is that while configuring, it is setting the method channel, it is getting the callback handle, and then it is using this channel to invoke a method known as configure, right? And it is passing all of those references here. So not just the background handle, but all the Android configuration references that we had added, right? So somehow it is basically invoking that channel, and now it is whatever result it is getting, it returns true or false based on whether it was able to get a result or not, right? So if you remember, when we tried to implement configure, it returns a future of bool. You can see there, right? So okay, so now it's using this channel to hit this method, right? So if we go back into the Java code, you'll be able to see, since it implements this method called handler, there will be a on receive method somewhere here. So if we go down, yeah, so basically not on receive, but on method call. And on method call will basically expect, it'll basically listen to certain methods that are being invoked. And you can see here the first one itself is configure, which was called from the Flutter side as well. So if this method is invoked, what it does is it takes all the arguments in, sets them into the configuration of variable here, and then if auto start is enabled, it starts it, or it just returns this value, right? So another quick uh, details on this config variable that is here, right? So if you go into this config variable, you can see that it's part of this config class which has been set up here. And what config does is that it is basically a shared preferences implementation. So shared preferences in a nutshell is basically some key value pairs that you can set within the Android phone, and it is not restricted to the app's lifecycle. So it'll stay there no matter what, and you can generally use it to access user preferences or those kind of small values that you need to store so that your app, whenever it's reloaded, it reloads with those user preferences, etc. So it's using config here to set those parameters in whenever you're calling configure from Flutter, and that's it. So it basically takes the parameters and sets them within the shared preferences, right? So let's go back into the Flutter code now, and in the Flutter code you'll see after configuring we are starting the service. So what does start service do? You can see start service again is the interface implementation. So to look at the correct full implementation of it, we'll go back to this class and we would expect a start method. There it is. And over here, you can see that it's invoking a method known as start. So if I go back into the Java code here, you'll see start is the next implementation. And over here, it is just calling the start and returning result.success. So if I go into start, I can see that it is using this watchdog receiver number one to enqueue a context, and then it is checking whether it's a foreground service or not. And this is the generic code to start the service. So if it is a foreground service, it starts a foreground, or it just simply calls start service using this class. So this class has to implement service, right? So if we go into this class, you can see, yes, it extends service. And now it is also binding this service using a service connection here, and this service connection would have been implemented on the top of this class itself. So you can go and have a look here, and I have mentioned certain resources in the description. So if you want to learn a bit more of how these things work, you can have a look at those resources. So anyways, coming back, what we can understand is that it is using a watchdog receiver. It is implementing these services, starting them off, and then binding itself to the service and having a link here, right? What is the watchdog receiver now? So if I go into the watchdog receiver, which has been implemented here, it's basically a broadcast receiver. And when I went into the code, I basically realized that its sole use case is to have an alarm manager configured so that it basically checks for the background service every 5 seconds. And if at every 5 seconds, if the service has been stopped to some godforsaken reason, it will restart it, given you have not manually stopped it, of course. So it is basically a fail check in which if at any point of time, if your service gets wiped off from the uh, processor, it this alarm manager will basically restart the service. So that's the use case of this watchdog receiver that they have added. So anyways, so now since we started the service and it called the start method here, now we can go into this background service to see what does it do when the service gets started, right? So now I can go into the background service here, and since I know about services a bit, I know that on create gets started first, and you can have a look at this method here. So now I'll just give you a brief of this method. What this method is doing is that if it's a foreground service, it is enabling and configuring the notifications that needs to be shown in the UI, right? And this part is setting another it is basically initializing the shared preferences config here and setting up a main handler, right? Now, this is simply what happens in onCreate. Now there should be a method known as onStart command, which is here, and this would happen every time the service has been called. So here it is setting this config to false. Obviously, it is enqueuing it again, and then in run service. Now this is where the actual meat of the logic for the service lies. So now here, what it does is that it firstly gets certain locks for multi-threading purposes, updates the notification channel again, and from here on, what it does is that it creates a Flutter loader and then a background engine, a Flutter engine basically, and then within that Flutter engine, it tries to execute this Dart entry point. So if I go into the configuration of this Dart entry point, you can see that a package name has been mentioned here, right? And just keep this package name in mind, and you can see that the function name is entry point, right? So what it's doing is that once the service gets started, it's initializing a Flutter engine, it is initializing a Dart entry point, and then it is taking out the background handle from the shared preferences and executing that entry point, which was basically this function within the new Flutter engine, right? And at the same time, it is also setting up a new method channel, which is by the name of and background service Android BG, right? I believe in the previous method channel, this BG part was not there. So the BG part is basically the new service, and just the Android part was the previous main plugin that we had. So uh, just to recap this again, what they're doing is as soon as you start the service, they are basically creating a Flutter engine, defining an entry point, which is that function and that package exactly, getting the background handle. The background handle in this case is the on start function reference that we had provided before, and now it is executing that dart entry point, right? So if I go into this implementation here on the Flutter side, I'll be able to see that. So this is the class that they had invoked, right? And they were looking for a function known as entry point, and you can see the entry point has been defined over here, and they have denoted it with another entry point pragma. So over here, since it's a new isolate, they are initializing the Flutter binding again. They are setting up an Android instance in this case, and now they are fetching that same on start method reference that we had provided here, which they had shared into the put into the shared preferences. Now they got it back from here using the list of args, and now they are calling our on start method within this new isolate with this service instance inside. So now things might be getting a little bit more clearer on as to why the implementation was like this before, right? It was we had to define like an onStart method which takes a service instance as a parameter. Now we know where it is being injected from. So this is how it's happening, right? And now from now on, what happens is that this service instance has this on method here, which as we can already assume must be listening to some kind of a method channel again to talk back and forth with that service and make some initializations, right? So let's go into how it is listening. Okay, so if we want to understand how this listening is happening exactly, let's just have a look at what the UI was doing. So when we were clicking on the buttons, the UI was invoking these methods, right? And it was invoking either set as foreground, set as background, and then over here as well, we had a listener setup, which was effectively listening to whether you had ever called this message, and then it was using the service instance to make this final call, that is to either change it to a foreground or stop the service or whatnot. So there was a two-way communication that was going on there, right? So firstly it was being invoked using the buttons, and then somehow it was being listened on this side, and then the invocation was happening. So to understand how this is exactly happening, if you have a look at the invoke method here, this is actually talking to the Flutter plugin. That was the first method channel that we had discovered in this case, right? Using the first method channel. So and you can already see that that method channel has been binded with the other service, right? So that is how the communication is happening. So if I go into the Android code and I go here, or before that, let's just see what that invoke method does exactly. So if you go to invoke method here, no, sorry, not here, over here, you can see that it is invoking, oh, sorry, this is the interface implementation. Yeah, so in this class, you'll have to see invoke over here. So it's using the send data message channel, basically a string on the method channel, right? And now if you go and see the send data implementation within the service plugin, which is this one, uh, over here, if you go and check, so configure, start, send data. Here you can see that it is using the service binder and it is invoking certain methods using the service binder. And if I go into the service binder and I see the service connection that they have made where they have initialized everything, I can see that they are calling receive data here, right? And this receive data basically uses a channel and invokes a method on receive data again, which has been which is the same channel as the one as the main plugin one, right? This one. So it calls the on receive data from here, right? And if I go back into the Flutter code, you'll be able to see that over here within this one, they have on receive data configured here, right? And it basically broadcasts a message using the controller, uh, and adds it to the controller. So since this controller is of a broadcast type, it broadcasts that message, right? And once it broadcasts this message, what will happen is that it gets your on the main side, the service.on will be able to listen to it, right? And now we get the control over here, which effectively calls service.instance set as foreground service. Now, the service.instance is connected to this method channel, which was within the service, right? So when you called set as foreground service, for example, it invoked that channel and then this message. So I'll go into Android and I'll go into the service, and here in the on method call, I'll be able to see set as foreground. Yes, right here, right? And you can see that when as soon as the code comes here, it basically uses the background engine and brings it to the foreground or it brings it to the background. Similarly, in the stop case, it just calls self stop here and removes itself from the watchdog queue. Right, so I know that this has been a slightly complicated workflow, and that was the exact reason why I made this video, right? Because when I came across this package for my use case, when I did not know the exact flow from the Java to the Flutter side, it was really difficult to determine whether this package could actually solve my use case or not. And if yes, how would I be able to optimize it to the best extent? So I hope it helped you guys understand this package. And that's it for the video. If you like the video, please drop a like. And if you have any feedback for me, please let me know in the comments below. And see you next time.